Originally, it was an ensemble, but as the show went on, Alan became, as they say, the linchpin. And they come up with all these.
When MASH hit the market in the 1970s, it wasn't expected to become something people leaned on. It was a war comedy, sharp and smart, but no one imagined it would turn into television comfort food, yet over time, that's exactly what happened. It settled into American living rooms and became the show people came home to. The kind that stayed woven when no one was really watching because it felt familiar, steady, safe. That feeling of safety came from trust. The show felt controlled. The timing was precise. The rhythm rarely slipped. Episode after episode reinforced the sense that everything on screen had been carefully watched over before it ever aired. Because of that, viewers assumed nothing ever slipped through. Every reaction, every movement, every detail felt intentional. But tucked inside that assumption is a scene that made it tore without being corrected. It was reworked later. It wasn't cleaned up. It stayed exactly as it was filmed. That unedited moment is what we're looking at today. So, let's slow it down, look closer, and catch the detail MASH left behind, hiding in plain sight. The mistakes, moments, and close calls MAS left behind. MASH didn't ease its way into American culture. It moved in, pulled up a chair, and stayed. What began as a sharp, fast-talking war comedy quickly turned into something deeper. It became familiar, reliable, the kind of show families watched together, even when everyone pretended they weren't paying attention. Week after week, it balanced wit with heartbreak so well that viewers trusted it completely. The writing felt tight, the performances felt lived in. Nothing seemed accidental, and that's exactly why its imperfections matter. Behind the polish, MASH was never as airtight as it appeared. Small mistakes slipped through, timeline hiccups, continuity errors, moments that didn't quite line up if you slowed things down and really looked. Most fans never noticed, not because they weren't paying attention, but because the show had earned their faith. When something felt off, viewers assumed it was intentional. That trust carried the series all the way to 1983 when its finale stopped the country in its tracks. Nearly half of the US population tuned in, making it the most watched prime-time episode in television history, a record that still stands. For one night, everything else paused. That's how deeply embedded the show had become. Set during the Korean War, MAS followed a group of overworked doctors and nurses stationed at a mobile army surgical hospital, patching up soldiers while trying to hold on to their sanity. Humor wasn't a gimmick. It was survival. Jokes came fast because the reality underneath them was heavy. The show understood that laughter and grief often sit in the same room, sometimes in the same sentence. But while the characters were dealing with chaos on screen, real life was causing its own complications behind the camera. Take William Christopher, the gentle presence behind Father Mulk. During season 5, Christopher contracted hepatitis, an illness serious enough to threaten his place on the show entirely. Production schedules don't wait, and the idea of writing Mahe out wasn't off the table. That's where Alan Alda stepped in. Alda understood what losing the role would mean, especially since Christopher had a young son with autism and depended on steady work. Instead of letting the situation quietly resolve itself in the usual way, Alda did something rare. He wrote an entire episode around Christopher's illness. The episode, fittingly titled Hepatitis, wonk's absence into the story rather than erasing him from it. Moments like that sit right alongside the mistakes fans never noticed. Together, they tell a fuller story of MASH, not just as a flawlessly executed television classic, but as a living, breathing production where things went wrong. People stepped up and a few unpolished details slipped through. Anyway, the line that hit too close to home on MASH, one of the strangest moments in MASH, doesn't come from a blooper, a missed cue, or a background slip. It comes from a single line that passed unnoticed for years, delivered casually, almost as a throwaway. In the episode Hepatitis, Hawkeye Pierce, played by Alan Alda, is doing what he does best, poking, prodding, and needling Frank Burns while pretending it's all just routine medical business. Frank, never missing a chance to complain or dramatize his own suffering, mentions that he has a pea-sized tumor under his sternum. It's said lightly. The moment moves on. numinous music, no dramatic pause, just another Frank Burns gripe folded into the rhythm of the scene. At the time, it was nothing more than darkly comic dialogue, the kind MASH thrived on, medical talk mixed with sarcasm delivered fast enough that you barely had time to process it before the next joke landed. The show trusted its audience to keep up, not linger. But years later, that line took on an entirely different meaning. The actor behind Frank Burns, Larry Linville, eventually passed away from complications related to a malignant tumor located under his sternum. Not near it, not vaguely in the same region, the exact place Frank once joked about on screen. That offhand remark from Frank Burns wasn't meant to linger. It wasn't meant to mean anything. But time gave it meaning anyway. The one episode gag that became MASH's humor. When MASH introduced Max Klinger, nothing about him suggested permanence. He was loud, he was theatrical. He wore dresses, heels, scarves, and whatever else he could find. All in a desperate attempt to convince the army he was unfit for duty. On paper, it sounded like a one-note joke. The kind of character you bring in once, get a laugh, and quietly move on from. Except that didn't happen. Jamie Farrar stepped into the role and gave it far more texture than anyone expected. Yes, Klinger's outfits were outrageous, but Farrar never played him as a punchline. There was commitment in every scene and a strange sincerity beneath the comedy that made the character feel human instead of cartoonish, and that made all the difference. At the time, not many actors would have agreed to parade across television screens in dresses and skirts week after week, especially in the early 1970s. Farrar didn't flinch. He leaned in. He understood the assignment and then elevated it. Klinger wasn't just trying to escape the war. He was surviving it in the only way that made sense to him. Originally, Klinger was written to appear in just one episode. One appearance, one gag. That was the plan. But audiences didn't treat him like a throwaway character. They remembered him. They laughed with him, not just at him, and the show's producers noticed. Before long, the one-episode joke kept coming back. Each return sharpened the character. The dresses stayed, but the layers deepened. Klinger became loyal, compassionate, surprisingly grounded. Over time, has stopped being the odd man out and turned into the emotional glue in scenes that needed warmth instead of sarcasm. Making Farrar regular wasn't just fan service, it was smart storytelling. MASH thrived when humor and heart shared the same space, and Klinger became one of the clearest examples of that balance. Strip him out of the series and something essential goes missing. Sometimes the most lasting parts of a show are themes no one planned to keep. The one prop Jamie Farrar never took off because it wasn't a prop. Max Klinger was famous for his dresses, his schemes, and his relentless determination to get out of the army. That's what people remember first, the chaos, the theatrics, the constant pushback against military life. But beneath all of that noise was a detail almost no one ever questioned because it blended in perfectly. The dog tags, they were plain, ordinary. Farrar had served in the U.S. Army before becoming an actor. And when he stepped into Klinger's boots, he brought that history with him, literally resting against his chest. That choice wasn't about method acting or making a statement. It was quiet, personal, and completely in line with how Farrar approached the role. Klinger might have been dodging duty on screen, but Farrar never treated the uniform as a joke. Years later, Farrar confirmed the detail during an interview included in the Medicine and Martinis box set. He explained that the tags contained everything real dog tags carry. His name, his serial number, and even his religion. That small decision adds a strange layer to Klinger's story. But it also explains why Klinger never felt fake, even at his most outrageous. Beneath the comedy was an understanding of military life that couldn't be taught in a set. The helicopter that unraveled into MASH. The Season 2 episode For the Good of the Outfit is remembered for its bite. It's sharp, moral, uncomfortable in the way M.A.S. Hoffman was when it decided to stop being polite and start being honest. The episode digs into corruption, accountability, and the cost of looking the other way, all while keeping its familiar rhythm intact. But while the history was firmly planted in the realities of war, the set decoration wasn't quite as disciplined. Hanging in Henry Blake's office is a model helicopter that feels right at first glance. It blends into the space. It looks military. It doesn't call attention to itself, which is exactly why most viewers never questioned it. The show had trained its audience to trust the details. Except there's a problem. The helicopter on display is Able UH-1 Huey, and that aircraft didn't make its first flight until 1956. That's several years after the Korean War had already ended. In other words, the Huey had no business being anywhere near a mobile army surgical hospital supposedly operating in the early 1950s. It's a small slip, but it's a clean one. What makes the mistake interesting isn't just the anachronism itself. It's where it appears. Henry Blake's office is a place of authority, a space meant to ground the chaos outside. By placing the Huey there, the show unintentionally lets modern military imagery drift backward into a period where it didn't exist yet, and still almost no one noticed. That's the power MASH had by this point in its run. The writing was so strong, the performances so natural that visual details like this slipped through untouched. The goodbye MASH refused to soften. There are TV exits and then there are moments that permanently change how audiences trust a show. The death of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake sits firmly in the second category. When MASH crossed that line, it didn't tiptoe. It didn't prepare viewers. It didn't offer comfort. It dropped a bomb and walked away. By 1975, Lance Stevenson had decided to leave the series confident his career would flourish beyond the 477th. In most shows of that era, his character would have been reassigned, written into a happy ending or phased out with a smile and a wave. MASH chose none of that. Instead, Henry Blake made it home, or so everyone thought. The episode sends him off gently. There are hugs, relief, laughter. The war finally loosens its grip on him, and for a brief moment, the show allows viewers to exhale, to believe that at least one good man escaped the damage intact. Then Radar walks into the operating room. No music, no build-up, just words delivered flat because that's how bad news usually arrives. Henry Blake's plane was shot down over the Sea of Japan. There were no survivors. That was it. No drama to cutaway, no final image of Henry, just stunned silence, frozen faces, and surgeons forced to keep working while absorbing the loss in real time. The camera doesn't look away because the characters can't. At the time, this simply wasn't done. Primetime television didn't kill off beloved characters without warning, especially not ones built on warmth and humor. Prioritization, humor. Fans were furious. Critics were divided. Some felt betrayed. Others felt gutted, but no one shrugged it off. The writers and producers stood firm. They explained that the choice was intentional, meant to strip away the safety net television usually provides. War, they argued, doesn't hand out neat endings. People leave, and sometimes they don't come back, even when they're finally on their way home. That decision didn't just shock audiences. It redefined what a sitcom could say out loud. Henry Blake's death wasn't about punishing a character. It was about reminding viewers that MASH had always been telling a harder story than its laugh track suggested. Comedy had been the entry point. Reality was the point. The own rule MASH made after breaking its audience. Henry Blake's death didn't fade once the credits rolled. It followed MASH off the screen and straight into the real world where the reaction was immediate, loud, and impossible to ignore. Viewers didn't just feel surprised, many felt wounded, and they made sure the people behind the show knew it. Hate mail poured in. Not polite complaints, not thoughtful critiques, raw, emotional letters from fans who felt the show had crossed a line they didn't know existed until it was broken. Killing Lieutenant Colonel Blake had shaken the trust viewers had built over seasons of laughter and familiarity. And for some, that trust didn't bounce back easily. Behind the scenes, the writers and producers paid attention. They didn't regret the choice. They still believed the episode said something important about war and loss, but they also understood the cost. The reaction was so intense that it forced a reckoning. Not about whether the moment was powerful, but about whether they were willing to put audiences through that again. That's when the pact was made from that point forward. If an actor chose to leave MASH, their character would not be killed off in a sudden, devastating way. And no more planes going down. No more blunt announcements in the operating room. Departures would still matter, but they won't ambush the audience the way Henry Blake's did. It was an unspoken rule born entirely from backlash. And it worked. Future exits were handled with more care, more preparation, and more emotional cushioning. Characters were transferred, promoted, or written out in ways that allowed viewers to process the loss without feeling betrayed by it. The show still took risks, but it learned where its audience drew the line. In that sense, Henry Blake's story didn't end with his death. It reshaped the series that survived him. It changed how MASH said goodbye, and it proved that sometimes even a landmark television moment leaves scars behind. The detail Gary Berghoff kept out of frame. For more than 7 seasons, MASH leaned heavily on one steady presence. Radar O'Reilly, the wide-eyed